Bibliophiles of the internet, my name is Audrey, and today I'm back to bring you my July wrap-up. First and foremost, things are still very much not great, and there are so many people who could still use our help and support in some way, so I will have an updated list of links and resources down below, and I would strongly encourage you to check that out. In terms of cool stuff updates, I guess, I did do my interview with Mason Deaver, which was fantastic and definitely a highlight. That's available on my channel now. I also did my AK Q&A, which was really fun, and I also wrote a review for Felix Ever After on behalf of We Read Too, so all of that stuff will also be linked down below. Thankfully, I didn't read as much as I did in June, I think, but I still read more than I intended. Oops. So let's just talk about the books. First up, I read my digital Arc of Party of Two by Jasmine Guillory, which is the latest in her Wedding Date series. It's an Own Voices adult romance that follows Olivia, who recently moved to Los Angeles to open up her own law firm, and the first night in town she meets this charming, handsome man at a hotel bar, only to find out afterwards that he is a US senator. Olivia doesn't want to date a politician, but the two of them agree to start seeing each other secretly to hide their relationship from the media, but when they do finally go public, it proves to be a test of whether their romance can survive the spotlight. Content warnings for divulging criminal records and other private information to the public, some incurred misogyny in the workplace, and graphic scenes containing sex. I enjoyed this romance. It's always nice to read about romantic relationships where both characters genuinely care about each other, and I always appreciate that the relationships Jasmine Guillory writes contain characters who actually communicate like adults. At least in this story, I kept finding myself surprised when the characters would just tell the truth and be honest about their concerns and their feelings. Typically in adult romances, when one character has a secret or an issue they don't want to discuss, it always comes back to blow up in their face later in the book, but that did not happen in this case. I also felt like the stakes in the relationship were much higher, and the reasons why these characters might want to date secretly were much more realistic, because intense political and public scrutiny would definitely shatter the delicate balance of any relationship. What kind of knocked the story down for me a little bit was the domesticity, and the sexual dynamic got a bit repetitive at times, and also because the inevitable third act breakup was kind of tied to this racial power imbalance in the relationship, which is incredibly valid, but it was never brought up until we got to that breaking point. I felt like that was a discussion we should have seen more of, but it didn't come in until there needed to be a problem, and that's why it didn't quite work. But like I said, I enjoyed it, and even though the pacing and the romantic dynamic was a little off for me, getting to see Olivia fall in love and live her life is still incredibly valuable and interesting regardless of craft or conflict. It's funny and charming and sexy when it needs to be, so overall I gave it 3.5 stars. Then I read my digital arc of Take a Hint, Danny Brown by Talia Hibbert. This also came out at the end of June from Berkeley, and it's the companion to Get a Life, Chloe Brown. It's an Own Voices adult romance about Danika Brown, a Black British academic pursuing her PhD, and she's also a practicing witch, and she asks the universe to bring her a new fuck buddy because she likes sex. When she's at work, she gets stuck in a lift during this emergency drill and has to be rescued by the rugged and attractive security guard Zafir, but then the video of him heroically carrying Danny out of the building goes viral, and suddenly they're the it couple on the internet. Zafir actually runs a sports charity for kids and figures they can play up the relationship for the media to get new donors and drum up interest, and if it means spending time with this attractive and sensitive man, how could Danny possibly refuse? Content warnings for dealing with traumatic familial loss, explorations of anxiety and depression, descriptions of panic attacks, and graphic scenes containing sex. Talia Hibbert has won me over once again with a romance that's equal parts soft, crass, delightful, sexy, swoon-worthy, and hilarious. Danny is such a wonderful character. She's a confident, fat, bisexual, Black practicing witch with an unforgiving sex drive who's afraid of commitment, and she knows it. I love how sex positive she is and that she's not ashamed of wanting what she wants. And I also appreciate her taking the time to differentiate that not wanting commitment is not the same thing as being a romantic, because it's not. The dynamic between Danny and Zafir is also really interesting because Danny is the one who doesn't want to commit and Zafir is the soft, hopeless romantic, and I think they both allow the other person to grow and heal within their relationship because of those different perspectives. There's also a great discussion about what romance can and should look like. The workings of a relationship are not the same for every relationship across the board, nor should they be, because a good partner should adapt and complement your needs and respect your differences, and the things we all need and feel and want are different. We've created a very narrow idea of what it means to be a good partner and be in a good relationship when a one-size-fits-all relationship doesn't exist. And and can actually be a really damaging concept. And while I can't speak to the representation of Zafir's mental health, I appreciate its inclusion in the story and how we see that he uses romance novels to cope with his depression and trauma, and how that motivated him to create a program for young athletes to unlearn toxic masculinity and learn how to cope with their emotional and mental stress. Danny is also extremely present and patient when it comes to Zafir dealing with his anxiety especially, which is really nice to see on the page. I think the story does slightly push the believability of a viral video shelf life, and I do get a little bit squeaky when it comes to how the cis refer to their own genitalia, which is a me thing, and I know that, but it was still such a beautiful partnership and I enjoyed it so much. I gave it 4.5 stars. Then Kathy and I buddy read our advanced copies of Phoenix Extravagant by Yoon-ha Lee. This comes out on October 20th. It's an own voices queer fantasy story about a non-binary artist named Njeri, who's a self-described apolitical pacifist who just wants to become an artist for the royal court and get paid for the art they create. When their latest job venture falls through, Njeri finds themselves scouted by an obscure branch of the military where they would be in charge of painting the glyphs that animate the government's automaton soldiers and creatures. But when Njeri accepts and learns about the depth of the government's crimes, they realize they can no longer stay out of this fight. Content warnings for familial disownment, depictions of colonization, incurred notions of racial supremacy, descriptions of beatings, and descriptions of injury and violence. Let me just start by saying that Yoon-ha Lee has an incredibly beautiful mind that goes places most of us could never even dream of, and they really make a meal out of those unique, ambitious concepts, and Phoenix Extravagant is no different. In case you somehow missed it in the synopsis, this story is about a soft, non-binary artist who's basically a magical coder. And that's badass. This story is set against the backdrop of colonization and war, very loosely inspired by Japan's invasions of Korea, with Njeri actually working for their colonizer, and that really makes you think about the boundaries we draw around ourselves and the contradictions each and every one of us has to navigate. That idea of contradiction really comes through with the automata creature Njeri is working on, because they're basically developing a grammar or a code through which this creature can exist and operate, and if the commands they paint conflict, that creates unpredictability, and unpredictability is the catalyst of choice. And when given that choice and that awareness, Njeri's world is altered fundamentally. Yoon-ha Lee is really great about developing emotional drama as well, whether it's tense cultural or familial dynamics, illicit lovers, or the manifestation of war. They really draw you into the conflict. I was definitely invested in these characters and their choices and how those choices are being challenged as war begins to come to the forefront. And they also provide an emotional counterpoint to the drama and the conflict as well, with this really soft emotional relationship between Njeri and the dragon Arazi, because there's genuine affection between them, and for every moment of destruction and fear, there's a moment of discovery and joy and newness. But most importantly, I love the way this story defies expectations. Like, you would expect the natural progression for Njeri would be to find out the government's corrupt, become outraged, take up arms, but even though they are learning about where their power truly lies, Yoon-ha Lee shows us different possibilities. And the ending is something I know a lot of y'all are not gonna like, but I loved it for how different it was, because at the end of the day, challenging us is what Yoon-ha Lee does best. This story challenges gendered societies, the line between art and function, and what the creator and the created are owed, if anything. And even though there were some interesting scenes I don't think we got to fully see, and I felt like the magic system could have been pushed a little bit more, I still really love this, and I gave it 4 stars. After that, I listened to A Beautifully Foolish Endeavor by Hank Green, which is read by a full cast. This is the conclusion to the Carl's duology. I'm just going to summarize the first book, which is about a recent college graduate, April May, who discovers this strange statue in New York that appears out of nowhere and has no discernible purpose, so she and her friend Andy make a video about it, which ends up going viral overnight. Turns out these statues, which April has dubbed to be Carl's, have popped up all over the world and no one knows anything about them. So suddenly, as the person credited with discovering the Carl's, April finds herself in the national spotlight, and this second book is about the fallout of those choices. Content warnings for some mild body horror, descriptions of blood and graphic injury, kidnapping, and some instances of internalized ableism. I once again find myself completely blown away by Hank Green's work, which I never thought I would say, and this story is so big, so relevant, so unique that I don't even really know how to talk about it. It's like a weird contemporary sci-fi story about the strangest alien invasion ever, but it also asks really big questions about power and identity, the existence of humanity, how we intrinsically tie our lives and our worth and our freedoms to companies and products, and what the future of humanity could look like. It is bizarre and overwhelming filming in the best possible way. It's about how human consciousness tries so hard to self-correct and make sense out of things that don't make sense or shouldn't make sense. It's a story that acknowledges that life is stranger than fiction and how all the spheres of our lives overlap in ways we could never predict as we all try to shout over each other and prove that our lives mean something and that the small ripples we create really do make a difference. It's so hard to describe because yes, it's about how humanity is constantly endangering itself by pursuing different ways to be mindless and surrender our agency and our power in exchange for entertainment. But it's also about the beauty of humanity because humanity is inconsistent and unpredictable, and because people stray from the stories their lives are supposed to tell every single day, and that is also a form of power, I guess. That inconsistency, while terrifying, means there's a chance of humanity's success, and the story tells us that as long as that chance exists, we have to keep working towards it. It's just a fascinating duology, so creative and inventive while also being extremely ambitious, but also clever and funny as hell. So overall, I definitely recommend it. I did think it wrapped up a little bit quickly, and there were some small moments of internalized ableism, like I mentioned, which I think should have been addressed further, but overall, I still enjoyed this, and I gave it 4.5 stars. Then I listened to The Undocumented Americans by Carla Conejo Villavicencio, read by the author herself. This is Latinx nonfiction. Villavicencio is an Ecuadorian immigrant who actually graduated from Harvard while on DACA, and after she finished with school, she decided she was going to go out and document the stories of her fellow Latinx immigrants. The documentation starts after the 2016 election, when dangerous anti-immigration sentiments once again came to the forefront, so the book is a mixture of different immigrant experiences and the author's own experiences. Content warnings for mentions of death, suicide, and suicide ideation, descriptions of racism and xenophobia, and allusions to trauma, chronic illness, and terminal illness. This came highly recommended on Latinx Bookstagram, and it really proved to be worth every recommendation and more. It's unique for a nonfiction book in the sense that the author is peppering in her own story and her own experiences here and there, but overall, she's really passing the mic to her fellow immigrants and making space for their stories. Undocumented immigrants make up a huge swath of humanity in the States and around the world, so those experiences are as varied and nuanced as you would expect from such a large subset. These interviews show us that the immigrant experience doesn't look the same and mean the same thing for everyone, and that your everyday Latinx immigrant is more than just a field worker, a day laborer, a housekeeper, and all these other ideas we project onto immigrants. Like I said, Villavicencio makes space for these stories and these voices and allows the people she's interviewing to linger on whatever matters to them, and that's what really keeps you captivated throughout the book. It also shows us how being undocumented intersects with every major sphere of your life, whether it's mental health, work, or healthcare, or religion, or education. A good example is how Latinx immigrants will often take on labor-intensive jobs, like emergency response jobs, that will eventually impact their overall health and possibly give them chronic illnesses, and then they need medication or treatment that they cannot access. So the collection really shows that undocumented immigrants have more than just stories about overcoming trauma and racism. Their concerns, their fears, their dreams are different from person to person, and they are deeply complicated like all of us. I really appreciated this collection of interviews and essays, and I think it's definitely worth the read. I gave this one 4.5 stars. I kept on the political nonfiction kick after that by listening to The End of White Politics by Zerlina Maxwell, read by the author herself. Zerlina Maxwell is a political analyst with a strong background in overseeing political campaigns, and this book came into being because of two facts. One, that the US has never had a president who wasn't a man, and two, because we've only had one president who wasn't white. It's about how Trump ran a successful campaign on white identity politics, how we once again find ourselves voting between two white male candidates, and how to hopefully shift power towards marginalized groups. There's a lot of truth in this book, and Maxwell definitely writes with a lot of insight, knowledge, and passion. I definitely agree that American politics is synonymous with white politics, and that there is no neutrality when it comes to policies that seek to undo or destroy human rights. As she says, politicians and policymakers should have clear stances and platforms that target concrete policies informed by their lived experiences, because that's where we get the most effective politics. Where this analysis fell a bit short for me was in its biases, its binary language, and its inability to factor in ableism and anti-queerness and all of America's other isms that contribute to us having having such a narrow ballot. Obviously, as the title suggests, the analysis is mostly focused on race, but for a complete picture of why we have the politicians we have, I think it's equally important to confront all the factors that contribute to our marginalization and to really understand who we vote for and how we vote. And again, the title and subtitle kind of led me to believe that this book would provide more concrete answers as to how we as everyday citizens can help end the legacy of white politics and ensure a more diverse ballot, but it really doesn't. It does serve as a reminder that we should remain critical and we should be making concentrated efforts to research candidates and their policies thoroughly, but I don't know how helpful that is considering that most readers should know that before going into the book. Like I said, it's an urgent and well-informed look at why the processes and systems that land people on the ballot are important to understand, but I think to truly understand our ever-flagging political systems, it would need to be contextualized by further reading from other sources, so I gave this one 3.5 stars. After that, my Patreon pick for July was my Arc of Each of Us a Desert by Mark Oshiro. This comes out on September 15th from Tor Teen. It's an Own Voices queer Latinx fantasy about a young girl named Xochitl who has the ability to take other people's stories into her body as a sort of cleansing, healing ritual, and then she releases them back to the desert to restore balance. But she begins to feel used by the people in her village when she hears a troubling story she doesn't want to give up and forget. And with her village being run by a murderous, merciless tyrant, she flees into the desert with the tyrant's daughter to see if there's a better alternative to the life she's always known. Content warnings for descriptions of graphic violence, injury, and death, allusions to animal death, and instances of emotional abuse and domestic abuse. This is an ambitious fantasy that really explores the power of stories, how we pass stories on to each other, how we hold stories in our hearts, and how the stories we tell ourselves really shape the outcome of our lives. It definitely calls to mind The Deep by River Solomon because it's also about one person taking on a community's stories and how those stories take a toll and have a very real and literal impact and effect. Just like The Deep, I feel like Each of Us a Desert calls us to recognize that forgetting is not the same thing as healing and that our obligation to ourselves matters every bit as much as our obligation to those around us. One of the more fascinating aspects of the story is the mythology surrounding cuentistas, which is actually different from region to region as Xochi is realizing as she gets further and further away from home, and that really challenges her relationship to everything she's been taught to believe about herself. I really appreciated that nuance of cuentistas serving different purposes because it emulates how a singular idea can exist across times and across cultures, but the manifestation of that idea or belief is rarely ever exactly the same from place to place. It's really nice to see how those different beliefs can coexist without there being one right way to be a cuentista in this world. But I really connected to Xochi's struggles because she's trying to understand her place in the world and where she belongs, and she doesn't want to be defined by her relationship to other people because she knows that she's worth more than just services she can render to other folks. As a cuentista, she's always thought that her role is to maintain everyone else's purity and absolve them of their sins in some way, but that doesn't leave room for her to just be a person with fears and hopes and dreams. When she takes on stories, they literally take up space in her body, and for the first time in her life, she wants to reclaim that space and make room for her own stories. So I think she has a really complex and emotionally satisfying arc. I will say this is not necessarily a plot-driven, action-driven fantasy. It's more of a thematic, emotionally driven story that's very slow burn, very gradual, so I do think it's important to understand that going into it. There was also an antagonist who started off seeming very central to the story, but they didn't end up playing as big of a role as I thought they would, so that also kind of threw me off a little bit, but overall I still really enjoyed this and I gave it 4 stars. After that, I read both Fence Striking Distance by Sarah Reese Brennan and Anna on the Edge by AJ Sass, which come out September 29th and October 20th respectively. I actually did a queer sports reading vlog for both of these books, so if you want to know absolutely all my thoughts on both of them, that will be included down below for you to check out if you would like. Also, both AJ Sass and Sarah Reese Brennan tweeted about the vlog, which just reminded me that the internet is a truly wild place. And the last book I finished in July was my Arc of Lobizona by Romina Garber, kindly sent to me by Wednesday Books. This recently came out on August 4th. It's an Own Voices Latinx contemporary paranormal fantasy about this young, undocumented Argentine immigrant, Manu, who lives with her mom in Miami, and she has these very mysterious, distinctive eyes. Her pupils are shaped like stars, so that's yet another reason why she has to hide herself away. But every full moon when her period comes, her dreams transport her to this strange other world world full of magic. When her home is attacked and her mom is arrested in an ICE raid, Manu finds herself on the run and follows those strange clues from her dreams to discover a world hidden within our own, where Argentinian children are either werewolves or brujas, a world that could be connected with her missing father and his traitorous past. Content warnings for ICE raids, anti-immigration sentiments, descriptions of intense menstruation pain, incurred homophobia in relation to side characters, incurred sexism and gender essentialism, and descriptions of blood and violence. Also, it's not necessarily a trigger, but I did want to mention that this story contains a lot of brief Harry Potter references. They're quick and surface level, but they are there, so you should definitely be aware of that as well. Something I appreciate about this story is that it does contain a binary-based magic system where boys from certain families are lobizones and girls are brujas, but Manu is constantly challenging and pushing back against that concept. Her very existence as a lobizona, a female werewolf, which is not a spoiler, it's the title of the book, presents a challenge to the system as it's always been, and that parallels the challenge her existence presents as an undocumented immigrant in the States. She's challenging these systems to make space for her because she's not running, she's not going away, she's part of these worlds whether people like it or not. And the metaphor of being magical parallels the idea of being othered because this magical world stands apart from humankind and has to be kept secret for its own protection. So as an immigrant and a lobizona, Manu is twice hunted, twice targeted, twice feared, and she has to fight tooth and nail just for her right to exist because she's kind of become a symbol for everyone who's wrongfully been limited or boxed into labels that don't fit simply because it's convenient. And there's also this really wonderful examination of borders where one thing ends and another begins, whether it's the literal borders between the US and Argentina, the border between Manu's fear and her agency, the border between self-preservation and freedom, or even the border between humanity and magic. In every sense, Manu has one foot on either side of these borders, and she struggles with feeling like she's both too much and not enough for any given circumstance. To me, the story is about how if we let ideas, traditions, and laws matter more than actual people, we are, in essence, drawing a border between what is and what could be, and we are creating a world that divides and confines us. Language and societal norms don't exist in a vacuum. They're things we engage with, create, challenge, and shape for ourselves. Overall, I was fully immersed in this world and its beautiful magic. I think the story thoughtfully explores the realities of being undocumented in the States today while also imagining this lush and magical world that is complicated and flawed in and of itself. I definitely recommend it, and I gave it 4.5 stars. So those are all the books I read in the month of July. As always, if you've read any of them yourself or if you would like to read them in the future, feel free to drop your thoughts in the comments down below. But that's everything I had for this wrap up today. Until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.